The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota plains like a hammer. It was not a season that arrived with gentle hints or autumnal grace. It was a conquest, a sudden and brutal occupation of the land. The sky, once a vast and forgiving blue, turned to a sheet of hammered iron, low and oppressive. The wind, born in the barren lands of the north, traveled for 1,000 miles without a single hill to break its stride, and it hit the small settlement of Prairie Creek with the force of a physical blow. It was a wind that did not just chill the skin. It seemed to hunt for the very marrow in a man's bones. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, found the smallest cracks in the daubing, and crept across the floorboards like a thief in the night. For the settlers of Prairie Creek, this was the great unifying struggle. They were a collection of stubborn souls drawn west by the promise of land and a life carved from their own efforts. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, people who understood the language of hard work. They knew how to raise a barn, how to break the stubborn sod, and how to face down hardship with a grim set to their jaw. But this cold was different. It was an adversary that could not be outworked or intimidated. It was a relentless siege, and their primary defense, the log cabin, was proving to be a flawed fortress. Every cabin in the settlement was built on the same principle, a design passed down through generations of frontier living. Thick logs, hewn and notched by hand, formed the walls. A great stone fireplace was built against one end, its wide mouth hungry for fuel, its chimney a column of rock and mortar reaching for the unforgiving sky. This was the heart of the home, the source of all warmth and life. But it was a greedy, inefficient heart. The fire roared, a brilliant spectacle of orange and red, but it was a desperate, fleeting warmth. To stand before it was to be scorched on your front, while your back remained encased in a shell of ice. The vast majority of the heat, the very lifeblood of the fire, went straight up the chimney, a useless plume of smoke and warmth painting a transient streak against the gray sky. The settlers were engaged in a losing battle for BTUs. The wind, like a knife, would find its way through the chinking, no matter how carefully it was applied. Frost would form on the inside of the walls, delicate, crystalline patterns that were beautiful and deadly. Water left in a bucket a few feet from the hearth would be skimmed with ice by morning. The cabins were thermal sieves, and the settlers were forced to feed them a constant, staggering diet of firewood. The sound of the axe was the settlement's winter heartbeat, a constant, chopping rhythm from dawn until dusk. Men spent their days in the frozen woodlots, their breath crystallizing in the air, felling trees and hauling logs on sleds, only to watch their hard-won fuel turn to ash and smoke with precious little comfort to show for it. They were fighting with all their strength, using the methods their fathers and their fathers' fathers had used, and they were losing. Among them lived a man named Klaus Richter. He was an outsider, a German immigrant who had arrived 2 years prior with his wife Ilara and their 2 small children. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his speech and his movements. His English was still thick with the accent of his homeland, and this, combined with his reserved nature, kept him at a slight distance from the boisterous, backslapping community. He was a skilled farmer, his fields neat and productive, but in matters of building and frontier craft, the others saw him as a novice. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes observant, taking in the world with a quiet intensity that was often mistaken for simple-mindedness. He had been a stonemason in the old country, a builder not of rough walls, but of intricate ovens and kilns, yet this was a fact he rarely mentioned. It was a skill that seemed to have no place in this world of log and timber. Klaus had watched the previous winter with a growing sense of dread. He had seen the immense labor, the mountains of firewood, and the meager warmth it produced. He had felt the drafts in his own cabin, had watched his children huddle near the fire, their faces flushed while their backs were cold. He saw the flaw, not in the effort of the men, but in the design of their hearths. It was a design born of abundance, of endless forests where wood was cheap and labor was the only cost. But here, on the edge of the Great Plains, where timber was a precious resource, the design was a catastrophic failure. He knew there was a better way. In his mind, he carried the memory of the Kachelofen, the great masonry heaters that stood in the center of German farmhouses. They were not fireplaces, they were thermal beasts, slow to heat but radiating a gentle, persistent warmth for hours, even days, on a tiny ration of wood. That autumn, as the other men were reinforcing their existing fireplaces and felling timber for the winter burn, Klaus began a project that baffled the entire settlement. He dismantled the large, inefficient stone fireplace at the end of his cabin. Then, in the very center of the small room, he began to lay a foundation of flat fieldstones. His plan was not to build a fire against a wall, but to build a massive, freestanding structure of brick and stone, a solid block of masonry that would become the new heart of his home. It was a radical idea, a complete inversion of everything the settlers understood about heat and fire. The community's reaction was swift and unambiguous. It began with curiosity, which quickly soured into skepticism, and then curdled into open mockery. The most vocal critic was a man named MacLeod, a burly, confident Scotsman who was widely regarded as the most experienced builder in Prairie Creek. He had raised more cabins than any other man, his axe work was legendary, and his pronouncements on any matter of construction were treated as gospel. He strode over to Klaus's cabin one afternoon, a small crowd of men trailing in his wake, drawn by the strange reports of the Germans' folly. MacLeod peered through the open doorway at the growing block of masonry on the floor. He grunted, a sound of profound disapproval. "Richter," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "What in God's name is this tomb you're building? A fireplace belongs on a wall, where the smoke has a straight run to the sky. You put a thing like that in the middle of your house, you'll choke your family out with smoke before the first snow." Klaus straightened up from his work, his hands covered in the clay mortar he was using. He wiped them on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "It will not smoke," he said simply. "The flue will be complex. It will hold the heat inside the stone." This statement was met with a round of disbelieving laughter. "Hold the heat?" another man scoffed. "You can't hold heat, Richter. You make heat and it goes up. That's the way of things. What you're building there is a monument to foolishness." MacLeod shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Listen to me, man. I've built 24 cabins in this territory. I know what works. Tear this thing down before you waste any more time. Build a proper hearth. I'll even help you. But this is madness." Klaus looked at the faces of the men, at their confident smiles and their condescending eyes. He felt a familiar pang of isolation, the feeling of being the stranger, the one who did not understand. But he also felt the deep, unshakable certainty of his knowledge. He had seen these heaters work. He knew the principles. He simply nodded. "I thank you for the offer, Mr. MacLeod, but I will finish this." His quiet refusal sealed his fate in their eyes. He was not just a novice, he was a stubborn fool. The men walked away, shaking their heads, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. The story of Klaus's folly became the settlement's favorite joke, a cautionary tale told around the roaring, inefficient fires of their own homes. The mockery did not deter him. Klaus worked with a patient, relentless diligence that was a spectacle in itself. While the other men were engaged in the frantic, muscular work of chopping and hauling, Klaus's labor was one of precision and detail. He worked alone, with Ilara bringing him water and food, her face a mask of worried support. She did not fully understand the principles behind his work, but she understood her husband. She trusted his hands, and she trusted the quiet confidence in his eyes. His days fell into a steady rhythm. He would rise before dawn, his mind already tracing the intricate, serpentine path the flue would take through the heart of the structure. He had a small cache of precious bricks he had bought in a town 50 miles to the east, and he used them for the firebox and the primary channels. The rest of the mass was built from carefully selected field stones, chosen for their shape and density. He would fit them together like a puzzle, his mason's hammer tapping and chipping, shaping each stone for its specific place. The mortar was his own mixture of clay, sand, and fine straw, a recipe learned from his father. It was a slow, laborious process. Each stone was set, leveled, and checked, the gaps filled with the thick, sticky mortar. While Klaus meticulously built his heater inch by inch, the world around him moved at a different pace. He could hear the ringing of MacLeod's axe from the woods, a steady, powerful rhythm that felled trees with impressive speed. He saw his neighbors reinforcing their cabins, stuffing moss and mud into the gaps between the logs, their movements hurried, driven by the ever-present threat of the coming cold. They finished their winter preparations, their woodpiles growing into small mountains beside their homes. They looked over at Klaus's slow, strange project and shook their heads. MacLeod had finished chinking 2 entire cabins and had built a new smokehouse in the time it took Klaus to get his masonry structure waist-high. Their work was visible, understandable. Klaus's work was a mystery, a slow, internal construction that made no sense to the outside eye. He was building a heat engine, though he would not have used those words. The design was both simple and brilliant. At the bottom of the mass was a small, deep firebox, not much bigger than a bread oven. This was the first principle. A small, hot fire burns more completely than a large, smoldering one. It consumes the wood efficiently, leaving behind very little smoke and creosote. From this firebox, the hot gases would not go straight up. Instead, they were directed horizontally into a long, winding channel that snaked back and forth through the stone and brick core. The flue ran up one side, across the top, down the other side, and back across the bottom, before finally being vented into a narrow chimney pipe that went up through the roof. The total length of the flue path inside the masonry was nearly 20 feet. For that entire journey, the superheated gases were forced into direct contact with the stone and brick, transferring their thermal energy to the mass. It was a heat exchanger. By the time the exhaust finally exited the chimney, it was so cool you could almost hold your hand over it. All the useful energy, the life of the fire, had been captured and stored within the several tons of stone and brick that now occupied the center of his cabin. The heater was designed to be fired once or twice a day. A small, hot blaze for an hour or two would pump enough heat into the core to last for the next 12. The masonry itself would then become the source of heat, radiating a gentle, even warmth in all directions, warming the floor, the walls, and the people, not with the fierce, direct blast of an open flame, but with the steady, comforting presence of a sun-warmed rock. It was a masterpiece of thermal dynamics, disguised as a simple pile of stone. As the first snowflakes began to drift down from the iron-gray sky, Klaus laid the final capstone. The structure stood nearly 6 feet tall, a solid, unassuming block of gray and terracotta in the heart of his home. To his neighbors, it looked like a tomb, a silent, cold monolith. To Klaus, it was a promise. He had bet his family's survival on a principle, on a memory from a distant land. Now, all he could do was wait for the hammer of winter to fall. The hammer fell in the second week of December. It was not a storm that rolled in. It was a front that snapped into place. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, rose to a ceaseless, shrieking gale. It picked up the loose snow from the ground and hurled it sideways, creating a blinding, scouring blizzard that erased the world. Visibility dropped to zero. The sky and the land merged into a single, churning vortex of white. The settlers called it a white hurricane, and they retreated into their cabins, stuffing rags into the door jambs and feeding their hungry fireplaces. This was the test, the true, unforgiving test. Inside McLeod's cabin, the battle was joined. His home was well built, the logs thick and tightly notched, the chinking fresh. But the cold was an insidious enemy. The wind hammered at the north wall, its ceaseless pressure forcing icy air through microscopic cracks. A fine powder of snow grew in a line along the floorboards. The great stone fireplace roared, consuming seasoned oak logs with a ferocious appetite. McLeod and his wife kept it stoked, the flames leaping high. Yet the warmth was a lie. It was a small, embattled circle in a room dominated by the cold. To move more than 10 feet from the hearth was to enter a different climate zone. His children were bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pale, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. A bucket of water set near the door had frozen solid. The heat from the fire was being stolen, sucked up the chimney, and bled out through the walls, as fast as he could produce it. He was working harder than ever, burning more wood than ever, and he was colder than he had ever been. Throughout the settlement, it was the same story. The constant, high-pitched scream of the wind was the soundtrack to a slow, creeping defeat. Families huddled together, their entire existence shrinking to the few square feet of warmth offered by their fires. The immense wood piles, which had seemed a guarantee of security just days before, were shrinking at an alarming rate. The cold was winning. It was relentless, tireless, and it was draining the life and fuel from every home. The traditional methods, the accumulated wisdom of the frontier, were failing. In the small cabin of Klaus Richter, the storm was a distant rumor. The wind howled outside, its fury a muffled, abstract sound, but inside, a profound and steady calm reigned. The great masonry heater, Klaus's Folly, stood in the center of the room, warm to the touch, but not dangerously hot. It radiated a silent, even heat that filled the entire space. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The floorboards were warm. The frost that had once coated the interior walls was gone, replaced by beads of condensation. The air was not scorching and dry near the fire, but comfortably warm everywhere. Twice a day, once in the early morning and once in the evening, Klaus would open the small iron door of the firebox and build a small, quick, intensely hot fire. He used far less wood than his neighbors, and the driest, most seasoned pieces. For an hour, the fire would roar in its chamber, the sound a low, contained rumble. Then he would close the damper, sealing the heat within the masonry labyrinth. And for the next 12 hours, the heater would do its work, releasing its stored energy slowly, steadily, into the room. His children were not huddled in blankets. They were playing on the floor with their wooden toys. Ilara was able to cook on the flat top of the heater, the surface a perfect, even griddle. They were not just surviving the storm. They were living in it, comfortable and secure. The heater worked. It worked better than he had even dared to hope. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the wind finally began to subside, its shriek diminishing to a low moan. The snowfall lessened, and a pale, watery sun appeared behind the thinning clouds. For the people of Prairie Creek, it was like the end of a long battle. They emerged from their cabins, weary and worn, to a world transformed, buried under massive drifts of snow. Their first and most pressing concern was fuel. The storm had consumed a terrifying amount of their winter supply. McLeod's woodpile was diminished by a third. He had burned through nearly a cord of oak in 3 days, a rate that was completely unsustainable. He knew he would have to venture back into the woods immediately, a daunting and exhausting prospect in the deep snow. A gnawing worry began to settle in his gut. They were only in December. If another storm like this came, or a prolonged cold snap, they would not make it to spring. As he stood there, contemplating the grim arithmetic of survival, he glanced over towards the cabin of the German. He saw no massive plume of smoke billowing from the chimney, only a thin, almost invisible wisp. He saw no frantic activity. He saw Klaus emerge, stretch in the cold air, and begin calmly shoveling a path to his small barn. The contrast was jarring. While McLeod felt drained and defeated by the storm, Klaus looked rested. While McLeod's mind was filled with the anxious calculation of firewood, Klaus seemed untroubled. Curiosity, stronger than his pride, began to gnaw at him. How had the fool fared? Had his ridiculous stone contraption collapsed? Had his family frozen? He had to know. Pulling his hat down firmly, he began to trudge through the deep drifts that separated their properties. He reached the cabin and hesitated for a moment, then knocked on the door. It was opened by Klaus. McLeod was immediately struck by 2 things. First, there was no cloud of smoke, no acrid smell of a poorly drawing fire. Second, he was hit by a wave of warmth. It was not the fierce, scorching heat of his own fireplace. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like stepping from the harsh Dakota winter directly into a mild spring afternoon. He stood there on the threshold, speechless, his eyes taking in the scene. The 2 small children were playing on the floor, dressed in simple woolens, not bundled in layers of blankets. Ilara was kneading dough on a wooden table in the corner. There was a profound sense of peace and normalcy in the room that felt utterly alien after the ordeal he had just endured. His gaze fell upon the masonry heater. It stood silent and impassive, a monolith of stone. There was no fire visible, no roaring flame. He reached out a hand tentatively and touched its surface. It was deeply, wonderfully warm. He looked from the heater to Klaus's face, his own expression a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and dawning comprehension. "But where is the fire?" McLeod stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Klaus offered a small, calm smile. He did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply gestured for McLeod to come inside. "The fire was this morning. It is done for now. The stone holds the heat. Would you like some coffee? The top is still hot enough for the pot." McLeod stepped inside and shut the door, closing out the biting cold. He took off his hat, his mind struggling to process the reality of what he was seeing and feeling. He had been so certain, so utterly convinced of his own superior knowledge. He had laughed at this man. He had called him a fool. He was wrong. It was a simple, devastating thought. He was wrong. The proof was all around him, in the gentle, life-giving warmth of this impossible room. His pride, which had been as solid and unyielding as a granite boulder, began to crack. Word of McLeod's visit spread through the settlement like a slow-burning fuse. It started as a rumor, whispered from one neighbor to another. McLeod, the master builder, had gone to see Klaus's folly and had stayed for an hour. He had come out looking dazed, like a man who had seen a ghost. The story was too strange, too improbable to be believed at first. But the evidence was undeniable. The storm had been a catastrophe for everyone else, a brutal lesson in the inadequacy of their homes. Yet the Richter family had emerged unscathed, their woodpile barely touched. The next day, 2 more settlers made the trek through the snow to Klaus's cabin. They made up a flimsy excuse about borrowing some tool, but their true purpose was obvious. Klaus welcomed them in with the same quiet hospitality he had shown MacLeod. They too were stunned into silence by the wall of gentle, pervasive heat. They touched the warm stone, looked at the comfortable children, and left with the same look of dazed wonder on their faces. The laughter that had once echoed around the settlement whenever Klaus's name was mentioned was replaced by a hushed, respectful silence. The joke was over. The true turning point came 2 days later. MacLeod returned. He did not come with a crowd this time, nor with the swagger of a man certain of his place in the world. He came alone, in the late afternoon, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a humility that no one had ever seen on him before. He knocked on the door, and when Klaus opened it, MacLeod looked the German straight in the eye. He wasted no words on pleasantries or excuses. He did not try to explain away his previous mockery. He simply held out his calloused hands, the hands of a builder, as if in offering. "Teach me," MacLeod said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a complete surrender of pride. "Show me how you did this."
"I was wrong. I was a fool. Please, teach me."
In that moment, Klaus could have savored his victory. He could have reminded MacLeod of his insults, of the community's scorn. But that was not his way. He saw not the arrogant skeptic who had mocked him, but a fellow settler, a father who feared for his family's safety, a builder who wanted to learn. He saw a man who had found the courage to admit his own ignorance. Klaus simply nodded, a deep and profound respect for MacLeod's humility in his eyes. He stepped aside and gestured for the man to enter. The lessons began that very day. Klaus did not hold back any secrets. He shared his knowledge as freely and generously as his heater shared its warmth. He explained the principles of thermal mass, of how stone and brick could act as a battery for heat. He took a piece of charcoal and, on a smooth plank of wood, he drew the diagram of the serpentine flue, showing MacLeod the long, winding path the smoke must travel. He explained why the firebox had to be small and the fire hot, to ensure complete combustion and prevent the buildup of creosote in the complex channels. MacLeod was a rapt student. He, who had always been the teacher, now listened with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. Why this type of stone? Why this thickness of mortar? How do you clean the channels? Klaus answered every question patiently, showing him the small iron clean-out doors he had built into the base of the heater. He explained how the entire system was designed not just for efficiency, but for longevity and safety. Over the next week, others came as well. They would gather in the evenings in the warm, comfortable cabin, a small school of hardened frontiersmen, learning a new and vital lesson from the quiet immigrant they had once ridiculed. When spring finally arrived, melting the great drifts of snow and turning the prairie to thick mud, a new sound began to echo through the settlement. It was not the sound of the axe, but the chip, chip, chip of the mason's hammer and the scrape of the trowel. The landscape of Prairie Creek began to change. Led by MacLeod, who had become the most passionate and dedicated advocate for the new design, the settlers began to rebuild. Some, like MacLeod, dismantled their old fireplaces entirely and built new masonry heaters in the center of their homes. Others, with Klaus's help, devised ways to retrofit their existing structures, building smaller, more efficient fireboxes and adding thermal mass around their chimneys. They worked together, sharing labor and knowledge. The project unified them in a way the shared hardship never had. They were no longer just fighting the cold. They were outsmarting it. MacLeod, with his deep knowledge of local materials, even found ways to improve on the design. Using a certain type of soapstone he found in a nearby creek bed, that held the heat even better than Klaus's fieldstones. The Klaus stove, as it came to be known, was now a community possession. The story of Prairie Creek's warm winters spread. Travelers passing through would remark on the curious lack of smoke coming from the chimneys and the surprisingly small woodpiles. They would be invited inside and feel the gentle, radiant heat for themselves. They would leave with charcoal sketches of the design, and a story of the quiet German who had faced down a Dakota winter with a pile of rocks and a revolutionary idea. The concept of the high-mass, low-burn heater began to migrate, carried by word of mouth and by the undeniable proof of its success. It became known in other territories as the Dakota stove, a piece of folk engineering born of necessity and humility. It saved countless lives and preserved acres of forest, a quiet, slow-moving revolution against waste and inefficiency. Years later, Prairie Creek was a thriving town. Its cabins were known for their warmth and security, even in the harshest of winters. Klaus Richter was no longer the outsider. He was a respected elder, a source of quiet wisdom. He never spoke of the time he had been mocked, and he never claimed credit for the transformation he had started. For him, the proof was in the calm, warm homes and the healthy families who lived within them. The true legacy was not in a single invention, but in the profound lesson the community had learned. They had discovered that survival on the frontier depended not just on brute strength or blind adherence to tradition, but on observation, on ingenuity, and on the humility to recognize a better way, no matter how strange it first appeared. It was a testament to the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not in a roar, but in a quiet, steady warmth. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom and humble innovation, share it with someone who believes in challenging the old ways to find a better path. And follow for more enduring stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.